Hey everyone, it's Michael here from the Red Line, and we're here today to talk about an update for the war in Nagorno Karabakh at the moment. I'm here with a good friend of the show and close friend of mine, Nick Mutch. He's been on the show twice already, and he's reporting. He's just come out of Stepanakert himself and has been in the trenches reporting on the war for the last few weeks. Nick is a veteran journalist of many, many conflicts, including Ukraine, East Africa, Venezuela, and all over the world. And he's going to be giving us a live update on what is happening in a pretty critical situation there in the Caucasus. So, Nick, to start off with, where are you at the moment?
So I am in Yerevan. Yerevan is the capital of Armenia. And just to make clear for people who aren't quite aware of the situation in terms of the geography, because it's quite complicated, the war itself so far is mostly contained within the de facto independent Republic of Artsakh, which is controlled by ethnic Armenians. So while there have been a few strikes, accidentally or not, into Armenian territory, for now, it's all going on in the Republic of Artsakh. So Yerevan is perfectly safe. Stepanakert, the capital of Artsakh, is a completely different story.
So obviously we covered a lot of this in our piece we did on Nagorno-Karabakh, and I highly recommend people listen to that, get a bit of background on what's going on here. But for this latest round of hostilities, because obviously we did that piece in April, how did these hostilities kick off? What started this war? Who threw the first shell on this one?
So there's no proof either way yet, but it seems the consensus has evolved pretty clearly that it was Azerbaijan that fired the first shots. They said that they were retaliating against Armenian attacks, but they haven't proved any of those Armenian attacks. So what I have spoken to is that basically people say that on the morning of the 27th of September, between 4 and 5 in the morning, all over Artsakh, there was a huge wave of shelling and drone attacks by Azerbaijani forces that hit towns including Shushi, including Martoni, including Martakert. A lot of them hit most of them hit military installations, but a good number hit civilian populations as well. And there were a number of civilian casualties all around Stepanakert. Within 24 hours, both Azerbaijan and Armenia had declared martial law, and troops and supplies started immediately flowing across the border from Armenia into the Republic of Artsakh. And look, it just deteriorated massively from there. It's World War II. It's like what you've seen in war movies. It's like what you've seen in World War II or something, or in a video game like Call of Duty.
So until very recently, Azerbaijan and Armenia had very similar GDPs. You know, both of them were up-and-coming economies until Azerbaijan obviously came across a lot of gas in the Caspian Sea and off the coast of Baku. And now their GDP is much, much higher than that of Armenia's. Is that translating to the sort of weaponry that each side is using? How well armed are the Armenians compared to the Azerbaijanis in the trenches there?
It seems clear, it seems fairly clear that the material edge is with Azerbaijan at the moment. Azerbaijan have been able to afford, a lot of the latest precision-guided. So we should probably go back just a little bit to the 2016 war, where Azerbaijan effectively tried to take Artsakh, but they were very, very quickly repelled. And then they had rockets, but they weren't very accurate. They had drones, but they weren't very advanced and were a bit slow and could be seen easily. Now we get to the 2020 war, and they have very good precision-guided weaponry. They had some of the latest drone technology that it seems to be clear it's coming from Israel, and it is translating to a material impact on the ground. It has allowed them to take large swaths of territory along the Iranian border. It's allowed them to take a lot of territory from the Republic of Artsakh. The north is a little bit more difficult. The terrain there is more mountainous. It's more difficult to make it's more difficult to make progress there. But so far, there seems to be a consensus that the momentum is with and the advantages with the Azerbaijani troops.
So obviously right now the front lines are quite fluid and they are moving very quickly, but to sort of summarize it for listeners who maybe not looking at a map, on the northern front, or the northern pincer, so in the northeast corner of Artsakh, the Azeris have taken a few footholds and taken a few mountains, but have not entered the very mountainous territories of the northern Nagorno Karabakh region. And in the south, they've taken almost the entire entire Iranian border, and are now sitting on the border of the Republic of Yerevan, where they've taken the entire southern corridor. But this corridor will be the easiest bits to take due to the fact that it's flat territory. It is what used to be full of Azeris, so there's much more morale going into that part. Do you think this is the easy part for the Azeris and it's going to get harder from here, or you think that this is just, they're doing really well in this conflict?
It's a little bit of both. Remember, when they tried in 2016, they weren't even able to take these territories. But so far, yes, to an extent, what Azerbaijan has taken is the low-hanging fruit of Artsakh. So if you look at a great website called the Caucasus Live Map, you can see there are two major offensives. One is in the south, in provinces of Hadrut, in the province of Martoni, and there's a little bit, and the Azeris have taken quite a lot of territory. But then you look up north at the province of Martakert, and they have taken only a very, very small amount of that territory. That's mountainous regions. Tanks aren't very effective there. There's more forest. It's a bit more forested, so you get the drones don't work as well. And yes, this is probably the time that Azerbaijan is going to have to think to themselves, are we really prepared to go all the way here and potentially ignite a more regional conflict?
So obviously in that 2016 engagement, the Azeris did push in, but they didn't get very far. They took a couple of small hills and that's about it. Why is this one so different, and how much ground have they taken compared to last time?
Oh, they've taken much more. Well, I think it's impossible to know for sure. One is clearly the material advantage that they've built up. Another is definitely Turkish support. Back in 2016, Turkey was having its own internal problems. Bad internal problems. It had the attempted coup that could have ousted Erdogan, and it was concentrated, it was dealing with, the migrant crisis in Syria and its relations with Europe. It didn't really have the time or the energy to focus on the conflict in the Caucasus. Now it's very, very different, and Turkey is trying to greatly expand its reach, whether it's in Libya, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in the Mediterranean, and especially in the Caucasus. So Erdogan has effectively come out and said to Aliyev, the Azerbaijani president, well, look, we know he's a dictator, and said, whatever you want, whatever you need for this conflict, we're going to give it to you. And so they've given them everything they can in terms of material aid. It's been, I think, pretty well proven now that they've taken mercenaries from within Syria and the Syrian border, and they're having them fight in Artsakh. There have been reports, fairly credible, but I can't confirm them, that Turkish special forces have been seen in Artsakh as well. And in contrast, Armenia hasn't had the same kind of backing, from the Russians as they had hoped they might get. And they don't have, and the international community, which would normally step in to try and stop a slaughter, is distracted by the coronavirus pandemic. They're distracted by the United States election, and so they don't quite have the energy to put a serious time and resources into cooling this conflict back down.
So I love from what the reports I'm reading, the Syrian mercenaries that are in there hired by the Turkish government, quite a lot of them are the same Syrians the US were training up under the Obama administration. When the Trump administration came in, they stopped paying them and the Turkish started paying them. Do you think there's any truth to those rumors?
Look, it sounds pretty reasonable, especially because when the Trump administration stopped paying them, a lot of these people became quite desperate for money. Now they were being offered money by the Turks and the Azerbaijanis, while they were very much going to take that money.
So the reports coming through right now are suggesting that the Armenians are losing equipment at a very dramatic rate. We're losing what is approximately $2 billion worth of equipment. That's 3,500 trucks. They're losing tanks. They're losing ebb drones they might have on them. is that the case on the ground? How does it feel do the Armenian fighters feel like they're losing all their equipment?
Look, when I was in Stepanakert and now when I'm back in Yerevan, the mood was getting glummer by the day. No one really wanted to go into detail with me, the soldiers, about the exact amounts of equipment or whatever that they're losing, but you can see them retreating. You can see people retreating. You can see people retreating to more dugout positions. It's very clear. Look, I've come across soldiers that they're not just running out of that kind of equipment. They're running out of body armor. They're running out of good weapons. They're running out of small arms, let alone major arms. And that's very well known on the ground. And it is quite clear that the Armenians are worrying seriously that they could lose this war. So
with all the equipment coming in, you'd expect Iran tried to send equipment, but obviously they were now been stopped because they're out of protests in Shirvan. But you expect the Russians would be sending equipment down because usually the Russians are the ones to supply the Armenians. Why do you think the Russians aren't throwing equipment at it like they would in previous conflicts?
Okay, again, it's hard to know for sure because you can only speculate. And one thing that I have heard, and I've spoken to people on the ground, interestingly enough, the relations with Russia, because normally people you speak to are very open about discussing anything. The only moment people get a bit awkward is about the relations with Russia. And anyway, what I have heard from fairly reliable sources is that the Russians are helping them with particular types of equipment, particularly with anti-drone equipment, because Armenia didn't really have any of that, and that they are discussing the potential use of the extremely powerful Iskander missiles. And basically people are now seriously talking about using it. So Baku has been seriously talking about targeting Armenian nuclear power stations with their weapons. Armenians behind the scenes are discussing striking major military targets in Azerbaijan with Iskander missiles. Now, if that happens, that's mutually assured destruction. That's the equivalent of the US. That's Cuban Missile Crisis level. We haven't gotten that far openly yet, but this is what people are talking about behind the scenes. Now, one of the reasons also that Russia hasn't invested quite as much in the conflict is one for sort of reasons of timing. It's a bad time for them with the coronavirus pandemic. They're exhausted and drained from the sanctions and the war in Ukraine. They've got Kyrgyzstan to worry about. They've got protests in Belarus to worry about. Again, they've got their economy, sort of teetering on the brink. They're just having they don't want to spend a lot of time and energy dealing with this in the Caucasus. Now, also something that needs to be pointed out about the geopolitics is that there's something called the I forget the exact name. It's the Common Security and Treaty. Let me just look that up. Yeah, exactly. It's called the CTSO. And basically that means that it's a little bit like the Russian version of NATO. And that means that if Armenia goes to war, Russia or Armenia proper is attacked, Russia is bound to engage on the Armenian side. However, so far, because the conflict has mostly been consigned to Nagorno Karabakh and Russia doesn't recognize Karabakh as part of Armenia, that means the Russians are not yet obligated under the terms of the treaty to send support in. However, we are getting very, very close. The Azeris are getting very, very close. I know, I heard their rockets. I saw unexploded rockets on the ground on the way from Stepanakert down to Yerevan, or down to Goris, which is the city on the border. But the Azeris are coming very close to taking something that is called the Lachin corridor. The Lachin corridor is the small and fortified part of the of a narrow road that separates Artsakh from Armenia proper. and there is a massive Russian base on that, really, really near that road. And so people are saying, look, if they cut the Lachin corridor, there is a chance that the Russians might move in. I mean, look, from my own standpoint, when I drove back, we took some fairly heavy shell fire on the road. We were fine, but we got stopped at a checkpoint, and I saw a soldier came to check our passports, and on his chest was written Armia Ruskaya, Russian army, and I could see the flags of the base in the background, and like, look, I have covered wars in the region before. And I have to tell you, I never thought I would be so damn happy to see the Russian army. I talked to another journalist here, and he was like, look, the situation is dire when you can't help thinking, the Russians really need to get more involved with sending their troops into their near abroad. That's what it's kind of like. So it's so weird after having, dealt with the Russians as an enemy right now to see actually now they feel more like the good guys.
Obviously, the Lachin corridor is incredibly important to this. Now, if Lachin is taken, effectively, you cannot supply your armed forces, or the Armenians cannot supply the armed forces in Nagorno Karabakh. How close to the Lachin corridor are the Azeris, and do you think they'll actually go for it?
They're within shellfire range. They're within missile range, and I know because I could see. I have photos of bridges, of destroyed bridges. I have, photos of unexploded rockets that hit the ground. That I can't tell you exactly in terms of kilometers or whatever, but they're definitely close enough to attack it. Now, I can't help thinking that before they cut it, there would be a few more serious discussions between, Turkey and Russia and Azerbaijan about how seriously both sides are willing to get involved in this conflict. So I wouldn't be surprised if you see a slight slowdown for the next few days in the advances on the Lachin corridor. As for whether they would take it, it depends really how, because one of the questions people are sort of asking is, to what extent is this an Azeri show of force to take back as much territory as possible, or to what extent is this the real attack? This is the real attack that people have been waiting for 25, 26 years. And that is probably something we will know over the next week or two.
So obviously these towns that the Azeris are taking have been in Artsakh control for quite a while now. They're full of Armenians. What is the reception the Azeris are getting? Are the civilians allowing them in? Are the civilians trying to fight back? What is the situation when the Azeris are occupying towns here?
I mean, to be honest, most civilians have just evacuated. The majority, I think something like 2/3 of civilians in Artsakh have been evacuated. And they're still look, I will give you here's a little story for you that tells you about the reception that civilians are giving them. When we first drove across the Lachin corridor to go from Goris into Stepanakert, we pulled over on the side of the road and we picked up a man. He was quite an old, portly man with a jacket and an AK-47 with 3 magazines taped together. He had absolute murder in his eyes. And he sat in the back. And while we were driving, I got my driver to translate, well, who is this guy? What is he doing? And they said, he has just come from Hadrut, a town that, Hadrut is a little area of Artsakh. His town was attacked and sacked by Azeri forces. Tonight, he plans to get as close as he can, sneak into the Azerbaijani base there, and take as many soldiers with him as he can before he gets killed. If you want to know what the reception is like, that's the reception. Like they're, suicide. That's a suicide mission, and everyone knows it. Did that happen? I don't know. But the guy looked pretty serious.
Mm. So obviously most of the territories that the Azeris are pushed into were formerly actually they were not part of Nagorno Karabakh, they're a part of Artsakh, obviously with Karabakh being almost the island in the middle. Have the Azeris been pushing into Nagorno Karabakh, or are they just in the Artsakh territories at the moment?
What people are talking about is they're quite close to Shushi.
Yes.
I should probably explain the importance of Shushi for both sides here. Stepanakert is the capital, but Shushi is the real strategic It's a really strategic, important place. It's a small town, maybe, it's about a 15-minute drive from Stepanakert, and it overlooks Stepanakert. Now, there are many reasons this is important. If the Azeris capture Shushi, they're not just within shellfire range of Stepanakert, they are within sniper range of Stepanakert. And that will make us see it that then Stepanakert is properly under siege. And the Azeris can effectively, if they wanted to, raze it to the ground. It's also, outside of strategic, it also has a lot of symbolic importance. It was, the Azeris consider it the cultural heart of Azeri Karabakh, and it was one of the towns that was most populated by Azeris before the war kicked off. When Armenia captured Shushi, during the first Karabakh War, that was really the moment that the tide turned and Armenia started to win the war and the Azeri army started to disintegrate. So this Shushi is going to be the most heavily defended and the most heavily fought over part, at least probably.
So they had a ceasefire a little while ago, but that was actually, broken by Turkish forces, not Azeris, not Armenians. It was the Turkish rockets that broke it. Why would the Turkish want to break and keep this war going?
Again, I'm not an expert on Turkish policy. One is, I think, their idea of pan-Turkism. But two, I think Turkey has seen this moment of international crisis as an option, as an opportunity to start spreading its influence as far as it can by supporting and using its own military forces. So I would give you an example. There was a ceasefire in Libya. I think it was about 2 weeks ago now that a Libyan warring parties announced a ceasefire.
About 3.5.
And it seems like this ceasefire has actually held, and both sides said that they wanted to continue this truce and nail it out. And everyone in the international community came out and said, we're really glad that this truce is happening. This is the first ray of light for the Libyan people in a long time, except Erdogan. Erdogan came out and said, I do not like this truce. I want the side I support to keep fighting. So there is something going on in the Turkish government at the moment that it wants to extend its force and its influence as far as it can. It's not just that, it's having disputes in Syria. It's having its disputes with Greece over their maritime borders.
So obviously, to get an idea of how intense the fighting is there, when I last spoke to you on the phone, there was lots of air raid sirens going off all the time. How frequent are air raids in this conflict?
So when I first got there, I was I first got to Stepanakert. I did a little bit of work, a few interviews, and then it was about 4 o'clock that an air raid siren went off, and we went downstairs. We just sat around, drank vodka, talking about what was going on. And they said, look, there's been an air raid siren every day for the last, 28 days or so. They said there were 2 days where there was not an air raid siren. And for those days, we actually got really worried because we were like, are they planning something even bigger? Then a few days later on Thursday, so these air raid sirens normally go for about 5 minutes. On Thursday, these air raid sirens went nearly all day. From about 10 o'clock in the morning to about 7 o'clock at night, it went every hour. It sounded like the air raid siren was on the whole time. Yeah, it's a lot is going on. It's this is very, very, very intense fighting. I've spoken to people who have been here who covered the wars in Iraq, who covered the wars in Syria, and they say that this is more intense than those. People are saying this is like Aleppo is the only, the siege of Aleppo and the bombing of Aleppo is the only sort of comparison people have from 21st century warfare.
Wow. So obviously the path forward that everyone thought was going to happen was the Madrid Accords in 2018, which would give effectively Nagorno Karabakh would be part of Azerbaijan, but it would be a self-autonomous region with a self-autonomous parliament. The Lachin corridor would be guaranteed. but the surrounding areas of Nagorno Karabakh, what is effectively most of Artsakh, would rejoin Azerbaijan. Do you think now that Azerbaijan has the upper hand in this conflict that they're going to be happy with that deal, or they're going to go and push for an even harsher, more aggressive deal?
Well, for instance, one thing that Azerbaijan has said in terms of autonomy from Nagorno-Karabakh that differs from the Madrid agreements is that they are saying that Nagorno-Karabakh will have cultural autonomy, but not political autonomy. Now, cultural autonomy to me sounds like a fairly meaningless phrase, right? I think the Azeris are pushing as hard as they can for Nagorno-Karabakh to have as little autonomy in a political sense as purely possible. And I think they feel because they've got the upper hand in this conflict that they can push for that.
So what do you think is more likely, if they cut the Lachin corridor and just siege Nagorno-Karabakh, make them run out of food and supplies for a long time, or to actually make the push and fight those bloody battles for Shushi and Stepanakert?
Look, I'm probably going to have to pass on giving you a proper answer here because no one knows. Really, no one knows. No one knows whether that would mean the Russians come in seriously. No one knows whether the Turks would actually want to back up a war where the Russians get seriously involved. Quite simply, no one knows. There could be some kind of political revolution in Azerbaijan or Armenia. There are just so many unknowns at the moment that it's really hard to give a roadmap for where this conflict will go. The only guarantee is that it's going to be bloody and that there are going to be a lot more people losing their lives on both sides, on both the Azeri side and Armenian side, and that civilians on both sides are going to get killed as well.
So one of my last questions is going to be, how well armed are the frontline troops? Because obviously you're hanging out with these Armenians. Are they using great equipment, or is it just old AK-47s and old mortar shells?
Look, I can't go into too much detail about what I've seen for sort of security reasons, but I've seen a lot of AK-47s. I've seen a lot of, quite old machine guns, rocket launcher or two. I'm not a weapons expert, but they don't look brand new. They look pretty old and rusted to me. There's not a lot of cutting edge military equipment we're seeing. We are seeing one thing that can't be taken away is that the soldiers seem extremely committed to the cause, and the morale doesn't seem to have broken yet. But it doesn't seem and so the question people are now asking is, with the winter coming up, will the Azeri military advantage be able to override the natural advantage that the defenders have in this territory?
So my last question, you mentioned a bit earlier in the interview about there being this Cuban Missile Crisis kind of situation where both sides are now looking at targeting, military facilities in Azerbaijan and also, proper facilities in the actual Republic of Armenia. What do you think it would take for either side to trigger that, mutually assured destruction?
Well, that's the thing. But so far, both sides are saying if the other side did this, they're fit. So if you can think of this kind of weaponry like nuclear weapons between the US and the Soviet Union, they're not nuclear weapons to be clear, but it's a good way to sort of get your mind around the kind of destruction. Because we're talking, remember, about two quite small countries, both geographically and population size-wise. So it wouldn't take a lot for both sides to basically annihilate one another. I have to say that, one, there would probably need to be, I don't think Armenia would do it without Russian authorization. I don't think Azerbaijan would do it without Turkish authorization. And at the moment they're saying, a no first strike policy on the kind of use of their most powerful weapons. I don't know. It's also too early to tell whether people are just mouthing off because of their frustration in private, or whether these conversations are being had seriously in the corridors of power. I can't make that judgment call yet. I will get back to you on that in a couple of weeks when we have a longer discussion, when I've had more of a chance to speak to people in the ministries or whatever. But for now, there are a lot of unknowns in this conflict, and there's a very big fog of war.
Thanks again, Nick, for coming back on the program. It's absolutely fantastic to have you once again. We're going to have you back on in a few weeks to do a full deep dive into the update of the Nagorno Karabakh conflict, you know, how Russia's now involved, how Turkey's involved, and what repercussions this may have for the entire region. We'll be doing a deep dive in about 3 weeks on that one. But for now, thank you so much for giving us a frontline perspective coming straight out of those territories and giving us the news fresh off the press. So thank you very much, Nick, and we'll talk soon.
You're very, very welcome. It's always a pleasure.